This is how a possible Third World War could have looked like had the Axis won the Second World War. The red side is represented by democracies like Free America, Australia, New Zealand, India and Russia, bundled with some ultranationalist countries that don't want to be under the boot of Germany, which is Italy, France and Spanish South America. The blue side is represented by the hardcore ultranationalist countries like Germany and Japan, who want to remain on the top of the world, bundled with their colonies, subjects, but also Britain and Brazil. This is the finale of Project Victory of Evil, so let me tell you how this would go. First up, you may assume that nuclear weapons would be used by either side as to secure a victory, but I want to dedicate a minute as to tell you why I think that this wouldn't happen. In the previous episode, I explored that farmland in Europe would become a scarce resource due to the German Civil War, but also at one tropa making parts of Europe unlivable. As such, this world war is not only fought for global dominance, but also for scarce resources like arable land. As such, neither side would be motivated to use nuclear weapons, which could make the majority of the world unlivable. So for the time being, this war would be fought conventionally, believe it or not. With mutual assured destruction, both sides know that any victory would be a Pyrrhonic victory. So how does this war develop? First up, the Germans and Japanese have an insane naval advantage, but also Britain is on the mix on their side. Looking at the red side, America, that was almost landlocked for 30 years, wouldn't be able to produce a strong navy, and even if they do, it would be in the Atlantic Ocean, due to the Japanese controlling the west coast, so the Pacific Ocean is fully dominated by Japan, while the Atlantic is dominated by Germany and Britain. Russia, much like America, was partitioned on both sides, and just now they would get a warm water port in the Black Sea, so their naval capabilities wouldn't be too great either, while Italy could have a strong navy and dominate the Mediterranean, but that's about it. France used to have a strong navy, but Germany seized it after the Second World War, and with that one tropa being built, the French navy is mostly situated in the English Channel, where it has a big disadvantage. The blue side undoubtedly has the better navy, so immediately blockades on the red side would ensue. Germany and Britain would seize the Portuguese Atlantic Islands and use them as naval bases, preventing American soldiers from landing in Europe and helping out there. As you can clearly see, this war has 5 main fronts that we need to cover, which is the North American front, the South American front, the European front, which has many sub-fronts, similarly with Asia, and finally the African front, so I would cover all of them in parallel. First up, let me start with Russia, which is now called the Vostokoslavic Federation. The country is going to be very democratic, looking similarly politically and ideologically to Free America, but since Russia has conquered so much land, they would need time to consolidate all of it, so they are undoubtedly weaker in the beginning of the war. Vostokoslavia and Free America were actually very close to each other, but I hadn't covered this in the previous episodes, as if you look at the map from the globe, North Canada and North Russia are only separated by the North Pole. Russia and America were never enemies by this point, they only started being rivals after they together won the Second World War, which is obviously not the case here. I can really see Russia and America to develop similarly and become great allies, even before the outbreak of the Third World War, and this is due to the polar route. Basically, planes started flying from North Russia to America in the 1930s, but this technology was perfected in the 1950s. Historically, the Soviet Union didn't allow the West to use their airspace, but now America and Russia would be very connected via the polar route, hence why Russia could become more democratically oriented with American support. I don't want to spend so much time discussing the polar route, but basically it is even used today by commercial aircraft from Europe traveling more quickly to Asia. A historical famous example is the Korean Air Flight 902, which traveled from Paris to Seoul in 1978, but it was shot down over the Soviet Union as there was a malfunction. Since this war starts in 1975, I hope that I have proven that the polar route actually works, so Russia and America aren't on the other side of the world from one another, but are basically neighboring countries, so of course plenty of Lend-Lease would arrive there. Now with this out of the way, let us look at the European front. Vostokoslavia is going to perform very poorly initially, due to them being so weak a decade ago, but the entire population of the country would be more committed to fight against Germany, as the majority of the population is comprised of people who were exploited during German rule, which would be repeated if Russia loses this war. So about 20 million Russians of fighting age would be willing to put an end to Germany and to free the world from ultranationalism. Looking at the map, Croatia, Serbia and Romania are in grave danger of being encircled. Only if Italy and Hungary connect to each other in Slovenia, which I think would happen, with the Italians bombing Austria temporarily as to slow down the German reinforcements, so this encirclement would be secured. Serbia would become too unstable and order there would likely collapse, which would make it very easy for the Allies to consolidate Serbia and cut Croatia off from Romania, so both Axis countries would now be encircled. In the meantime, Spain wouldn't be doing too great either. Their economy and army would be solid, but they would be among the worst hit by the failure of Atuantropa, which would cause some issues. Spain has control over the Gibraltar Dam, so if they choose they can flood Atuantropa and cause millions of casualties on both sides. But this would hit mostly Italy and France, due to them dominating the Mediterranean the most. I think that Germany is likely going to give the green light, seeing how this could benefit Spain and their own war effort, while hurting the Allied positions in southern Europe. As such, in February of 1976, Atuantropa would get blown up, causing several millions of civilian casualties on both sides, and the water levels would start to rise to what they were before construction. By this point, Germany is actually getting really desperate, due to them being in a civil war only 6 years prior, and most of their country would be uninhabitable. So if they don't secure a quick victory, they wouldn't have a chance anymore, hence why something radical as blowing up Atuantropa could be done. Further, the German Reichskommissariats of the Netherlands, Belgium, Norway, Sweden, Switzerland and Bohemia are likely going to fully rebel, where the Baltic states will do the same, but with a greater intensity, linking up with Russia and consolidating most of the North Baltic. Spain is also on the run, as they would be pressured from France and Portugal in Europe, and by Italy in North Africa, so Spain is also theoretically encircled. Britain would try to quickly seize Ireland, which is more important than you may think, as if American soldiers arrive in Ireland, this could start terror bombing campaigns over Britain, so Gross Britannia would use their navy to isolate Ireland and to land in the north, trying to take out the country. After a year of combat, the front lines in Europe would look like this, but let me show you the other fronts. Let me go over to North America, as I mentioned Free America several times, but would they be able to send over support to Europe? Well, America would be fighting the Pacific States of America, the Japanese colony on the US West Coast, and I think that American soldiers would outnumber the Japanese ones several times. Japan does control the Pacific Ocean, so they are likely going to send in many reinforcements, but still America has a larger population than Japan even in this alternate history, so due to proximity and manpower, Free America would have the advantage and would start pushing Japan back. How much so is a different question. I think that America would eventually win in this front, but it would take several years, let us say 3 for the sake of argument. Instead of hopping around the world and telling you how Free America is doing, I would have them to reach the Pacific coast as of right now for simplicity's sake, but note that this would take several years and both sides would suffer millions of casualties. This however wouldn't change much. America is stronger with this move, but the Pacific and Atlantic Oceans are strongly dominated by the Axis, so any American reinforcements into other fronts would be a really dumb idea. As such, Free America is kind of isolated from helping out the rest of their allies. Due to the polar route, some help would arrive in Russia, but this isn't going to change the tides of the European front, or even the Asian front. Realistically, what Free America can do is intervene in South America and help defeat Brazil, which could open up the way for American soldiers to land in Africa and help out there as well. Due to the insane naval advantage of the Axis, I would say that America is existing in a vacuum, not being able to help out the rest of their allies, who would become more isolated as a result of that. So how does Free America reach the South? Well, Central America is in the way. Either they collaborate or are invaded. Regardless, Free America would move in troops and rush to Brazil. The problem is that Central America is unlikely to cooperate, and they may be invaded unwillingly, which would boost the Axis cause for preserving the current world order, under which not many wars had started, and the Allies are going to be portrayed as imperialistic nations. Unfortunately, this may work. While Brazil is fighting on all sides, they may not perform so terribly and manage to hold their ground, due to the Brazilian industry and strong manufacturing, which would give them the edge over their enemies. I think that the Spanish-speaking countries would be more inefficient than you may think. Historically, Argentina invaded the Falklands in 1982, and as you know, they failed. Now Argentina is fighting Brazil in 1975, so the difference there is not that immense. Argentina at the same time was ruled basically by a military dictatorship, and now they're ultranationalist, so this Argentina is similar to the one we had in our own history, which makes me think that they're going to fail short of their goal to get Brazil out of the war and secure South America. This war I think would actually favor the Axis, who can supply and give land-lease to the Brazilians, but the Allies on the other hand cannot do too much to support their side. Even if there is a land bridge from Free America to South America, there would be several choke points, so the Axis taking Panama would result in the entirety of South America to be encircled and isolated. Moving over to Asia, this is where the true horror, most devastation and casualties would ensue. Previously I had covered how Indonesia, Vietnam and the Philippines wouldn't be loyal to Japan, and this could be their best opportunity to rise and secure their actual independence. China I also haven't mentioned much, as they were broken into several smaller states by Japan, with the aim of consolidating their control there. The Chinese are going to become for the Japanese like the Russians were for the Germans during their civil war. As to not repeat myself here, the Japanese are going to heavily struggle to contain the growing Chinese population, and due to the lower urbanization and higher fertility rates, China would retain their identity and remember how Japan enslaved them. As such, I think this is a surprise to no one, but China would revolt against Japan. The Japanese would control almost the entirety of the industry, as China would be deindustrialized and their industry would be stolen and moved to Japan, so these Chinese revolutionaries are going to be very poorly armed, but be very much determined to fight. Due to the lack of navy on the Allied side, America cannot send China any equipment, while Russia doesn't have land connection to help China out. There would be fighting in Siberia, but it would be pointless for me to cover, as neither side would make any meaningful progress. Turkestan is also quite interesting, as they would not only claim the Caucasus and want to reach as far as the Indian Ocean, but China has a province called East Turkestan, which is going to be part of the irredentist claims of Turkestan, hence why I can see this province to start to get overrun, but similarly with Siberia, these lands are too sparsely populated, so any progress there would be too slow. Similar situation would be in Mongolia. The goals of Russia and Turkestan would be to take the Far East and reach the Chinese rebels, where they can aid them and free the people from Japanese rule. The Japanese faction on the other hand would be focused on defending the Far East while containing China, but most importantly making sure that no revolts are sparked up in Southeast Asia. Free India is fighting on all fronts, and their population is about 500 million people, who are very committed, much like the Chinese, to topple down the Japanese-led order in Asia. As such, for the Allies, one main goal would be to safeguard India, as if they fall soon, then their odds of victory would be greatly reduced. As such, Vostokoslavia and Turkestan may attempt to do something very risky, which is to invade Afghanistan and Iran. Turkestan had already claimed these lands, but now if this is done, they can almost reach India and establish a land bridge, which would save the Allied war effort. The invasion of the Middle East would go through with American approval, but I think that this would escalate. Iraq would also claim Turkish lands and Iranian territories, so they are going to join the Allies despite being ultranationalists themselves, while Saudi Arabia obviously joins the Axis with the goal of kicking out the Allies and uniting the Arabian Peninsula under themselves. The main question of this video would be, would Indonesia, Vietnam and the Philippines revolt, as this likely determines what outcome this world war would get. Previously I covered how Japan would portray America as the aggressors and brainwash the people that the Americans are going to colonize them again, and this propaganda may actually work, but it's difficult to say, hence why I would need to split the scenario into two parts, one where they rebel, which is this video, and another where they stay loyal with Japan, which would be a bonus episode I would make in the future. So here we have Southeast Asia mostly rebelling. Of course I would be oversimplifying this heavily, as there is no way to tell exactly where these revolts would start, nor how strong they would actually be, so I would go with these fictional borders. What I can see happening right away is that Siam would switch sides. I explained in the second episode of the series how Siam would be allowed to retain their industry and military, but would become practically a Japanese client state, something that they're going very much to dislike, and now they can reassert their independence. No matter if the rest of Southeast Asia rebels, I think that Siam is switching sides regardless. This move would for sure keep the Japanese navy very busy, as they would have to resupply pockets of resistance against the rebels, while also blockading Australia and New Zealand from sending in any reinforcements as to aid the rebels. Japan's navy is much more preoccupied, which could give the Allies an advantage on other fronts, such as the one in India and the Middle East. Saudi Arabia is the easiest to cover, as they are practically encircled, and with a weak industry, no naturally defendable lines, low population and no Japanese support, I think that they may crumble. While the Saudi Arabian oil would be an important resource for the Axis as to win the war, in 1975 the production of oil in Saudi Arabia was only starting to pick up, and in the 1980s it had already crashed. The 1979 oil crisis happened in our own history in the wake of the Iranian Revolution and later Iraqi invasion of Iran. Although the oil production dropped only by 4%, it resulted in global oil price to almost double. Right now the year in this alternate history would be close to 1979, so history would repeat itself here and this oil shock would cause an energy crisis on the entire world. The United States of America had been one of the main producers of oil, which I can see happening here as well, so they're not going to be affected too much, but they cannot export it to their allies. Italy would have a bit of oil due to their Arabian holdings, but most of the oil wells there I think would be destroyed, putting Italy in a rather bad position. Russia and Turkestan are going to lack in oil, but America could supply some via the polar route. The Axis on the other hand aren't doing too hot either. Romania and Turkey are the only major oil producers in Europe, and I covered how Romania would become encircled and start to get pushed back, while Turkish oil in the Caucasus is close to the Turkestani border, so I think that the Baku oil fields are going to be blown up somehow. This leaves Iran on the side of the Axis as the only reliable oil producer, but they would be under heavy threat from Turkestan. So this is the situation as of right now. The Axis have the advantage of navy and likely aircraft and tanks, but all of these would require oil to operate efficiently. The Allies don't have such war equipment, but they hold most of the world oil. So what does this actually mean? Well, the Axis would have a stockpile of oil, but once this run out, they would lose their advantage of military equipment and the tides of the war would shift against them. As I said earlier in the video, Germany is on a ticking time bomb and they need to secure a victory soon, or else their gains would be reversed. Going over to Africa, I want to cover the Great African Revolt that is going on and how it may develop. First up, Madagascar would be overrun by the rebels, and I can also see Spanish North Africa to see the same fate, either due to rebels or Italian advancements. Regardless, Spain is kicked out of Africa. This only leaves the fragile white German governors that were sort of fighting each other in the interwar period, and they would be the only defenders of the African continent for the Axis. Reinforcements would be sent there, but the Axis would prefer to guard other fronts and would slightly neglect Africa, which although it has abundant resources, they are not urgently needed unlike oil. Now if you thought that China and Southeast Asia in general are going to be fighting a guerrilla war, in Africa it would be 1,000 times worse than Vietnam, where the German governors would lose soldiers that are not going to be replenished due to ambushes and attacks. I can see the African rebels to start gaining ground, and the more they liberate themselves, the more their cause would become. Even the opposite is true. The more they're contained by the Germans, still the more popular their cause of independence would become. It looks like the African rebels are set to take the continent, so I would have this eventually happen. Just know that due to the poor infrastructure and the big size of Africa, this is likely going to take about 5 years in total, and would be happening in parallel with the other fronts that I have discussed and will discuss after this point. This would be a very bloody front, but I think that the African resistance has a great advantage, in addition to receiving support from Italy and Portugal. Of course, Italy would also suffer nationalist rebellions in their Arab territories, which are going to be supported by Turkey and the rest of the Axis. So what happens there is a tough call, but likely the Italian army with allied support manages to contain these and could appease the revolutionaries. The entire continent would become a bloodbath, that's for sure. Going back to Europe, last time I checked the continent, the war was still at its infancy, but now it would escalate way more, so let us see how Europe would get changed. First up, I think that the Allies are likely going to clear up the Balkans, so Croatia and Romania would eventually fall, in addition to half of Slovakia. Turkey is going to get pushed back to Istanbul, with parts of the Caucasus being taken, but also due to Iraq being in the war, they can rally the Kurdish people to rebel. Turkey in this alternate history would have pursued policies of ethnic cleansing against everyone, so this could get the Kurdish people to rebel and even the Arabs in Syria. At this point, Turkey may call for a jihad against the Allies, but Turkestan is likely going to do the same against the Axis, so the Islamic world would be very split. Spain may become overrun as the war would start in 1975, which is precisely when Francisco Franco would die. Unlike our own history, the monarchy wouldn't be restored, but an ultranational successor of Franco that we have never heard of would take charge. In the midst of the chaos, as well as Spain losing their African colonies, I think that guerrilla war would start in the country, which would aid the Allies in taking over Spain and establishing a provisional government. Ireland on the other hand would be less lucky. The British blockade would be very effective in preventing the Irish from getting any outside help, and with the landings in Northern Ireland expanding, I think that Ireland would soon fall to Axis control. France may have secured their southern flank, but Germany is still a beast up north. Despite their civil war, they may push deeply into France, taking out Belgium and the Netherlands in the process, while Switzerland would retreat into the mountains and hold out there. Regarding Ostwand, I think that Russia would overrun most of it, so looking at the map, Germany and Britain are fighting everyone else in Europe, where their manpower and industry is going to be lower compared to their enemies. At this point I think that the Axis would start running into serious oil shortages, so their advantages would be cut short, but the Axis still has plenty of rockets that would be used during the war as to destroy allied cities and industry, but also both sides have nuclear weapons, which were still not used during the war. Going over the entire Axis situation around the world, Brazil is barely holding on, but with more American support they could lose Uruguay and suffer destruction to their population centers, which would trigger plenty of rebellions there. Brazil still wouldn't surrender, but they're heavily disadvantaged in this war, and are slowly but surely being pushed back. Africa I already covered, with the continent eventually going to become an allied stronghold, while the story would be similar with the Middle East. Turkey would lose their non-Turkish majority areas rather soon, and I think at this point Istanbul may fall, so the rest of Anatolia is very vulnerable. It would not collapse immediately, but I think that Turkey is so far very crippled, so they're going to be much like Brazil, slowly but surely being pushed back until they surrender. The rest of Asia is a whole different story. India is likely going to reclaim the south, which I can see plenty of resistance from the locals, due to the cultural differences and Axis propaganda, but I think that Afghanistan and Iraq are going to be mostly dealt with, and Pakistan is by far not a strong country in the 1980s, even in this alternate history. In fact, with a lot of Japanese exploitation, Pakistan may become weaker than historically. Turkestan would push into China, while Tibet would switch sides, so Russia would connect with India and encircle Pakistan. The Pakistani nation is in the same boat as Brazil and Turkey, not being defeated right away, but their fate is pretty much sealed. Siam would help greatly in defeating Azad Hind, which means that India would recover and conquer most of the subcontinent. Down in Southeast Asia, the anti-Japanese rebels are going to consolidate control there, and as Japan also runs out of oil, the Australians and New Zealanders would help consolidate Indonesia and the Philippines, while Vietnam would help out China in the 1980s, quite literally the opposite of what happened from our own history. You could say that in this alternate world, Japan would fear the domino effect, where if one of their subject rebels, then the rest would follow, starting a domino effect that would end their empire, which has been the case for this episode. China would mostly liberate the region, but Japan would still control the coastal areas, and also much of northern China. Let me zoom out to the entire world so you can see what this actually looks like. Let us say the year is 1981, so 6 years after total war. Germany at this point would be getting very desperate. Their victory is not so far away, as they could secure Europe, starting a domino effect in their favor, but it's also far from secured. The problem is that in a prolonged war, the Germans are heavily disadvantaged, so their war at victory would slowly but surely keep going down with each passing day. Germany needs to do something daring or risk eventually losing their hegemony over the world. Do you start to see how the use of nuclear weapons may unleash hell on the entire Earth? Just so you know, in 1980, in our own history, is when the world was at their peak in terms of number of nuclear warheads, so this is possibly the worst time for any nukes to be used. I would say that Free America has about 5,000 nuclear weapons, Germany has about 30,000, Italy has close to 100, Britain would have 500, and Japan would have 5,000. Russia is unlikely going to have any, or if they do, they wouldn't make a difference or get mentioned. The Axis would have the advantage when it comes to the nukes, but the Allies would control a larger share of the Earth, so the destruction this mutual exchange of nukes would cause would be even for both sides. So does this war escalate into nuclear conflict? Well, Germany knows that they're going to lose the war if it all goes the same way as before. At this point, Germany is in the same position as they were in 1944 to 1945 in our own history, but they are going to be even more desperate and have about 30,000 nukes on their disposal. Here is a historical parallel I can make. Do you think that the Austrian painter would have used nuclear weapons in 1944 if he had any? I think that overwhelmingly he would, trying to reverse the trend of the war, so I can see Germany to do the same in this alternate Third World War. So what are the main targets? Well, Germany has so many nuclear weapons and a giant reach that they could nuke every city within the Allied borders that has over 100,000 inhabitants. And if all of these impact successfully, it would kill 50% of the Allied population just like that. Germany is going to target such population centers, but also military facilities, ports and airports. Even tactical nukes would be used in Eastern Europe as to slow down the Russians. America's response would be kind of the same, targeting the largest population centers in Germany and Britain, while ignoring Japan, which in the eyes of America would get inevitably defeated by the rebels and Russians, while Germany is so far the biggest threat. The thing is that America has to respond with nukes of their own, whether they like it or not. This would open Pandora's box. Now I know that the Germans would be aware of mutually assured destruction, but they are already losing the war regardless. So with this move and their nuclear advantage, they may be willing to roll the dice, and perhaps the outcome is one where they succeed. On the 1st of October 1981, nuclear weapons would start flying on both sides. Some may be intercepted, but most wouldn't be and impact their targets as a result of that. The war would effectively stop after this point. This is because law and order would collapse on both sides, so soldiers cannot communicate and coordinate effectively, so this would put an end to any major military battles. Of course, there would be many poorly coordinated skirmishes, but these are unlikely to result in much. While there is not going to be an official peace treaty, the amount of destruction likely leads to the war stopping and for the borders to freeze. I cannot predict how these borders would look like, as likely in some regions there is no longer countries, but rather rogue armies. Most of the world would become warlord states. As the radiation would set in, it makes most of the world unlivable, as there is so many places where food cannot be grown, as the radiation and climate would reduce the green areas at least by half. If you remember a detail I gave you sooner, I said that nuclear exchange happens on the 1st of October, so the northern hemisphere, where the majority of the people would live, is entering the season of winter. I think that nuclear winter would ensue as a result of that, dropping the temperature drastically worldwide. If you're wondering how bad this would actually be, with the amount of nuclear weapons being exchanged, in Europe it would get so bad that the Dnieper river would get to freeze, so anything north of that would become quite difficult to grow food, not to speak of the radiation. Due to this, the climate of North Africa may become similar to that of Germany today, so agriculture may begin to thrive there, and the Sahara Desert may slowly start to turn green and become more inhabitable. Looking at the world map, this is where I can say that food can be safely grown, and as you can see, Europe is mostly unlivable, with South America being affected but not as poorly, while North America has some no-go zones, but there is still plenty of land for people to thrive in. Asia is a different story. The bulk of the nuclear weapons and destruction would be caused there, so India would become quite unlivable, and this is the most populated country on Earth, with China suffering a similar fate. As for the death toll before the nuclear escalation, it would be 20 million military casualties in Europe with 50 million civilian ones. Much of it was caused by the destruction of Atlanta. This death toll just in Europe is close to what the entire world suffered during the Second World War in our own history, but it doesn't stop there. Then in North America there would be 4 million military casualties and 5 million civilian ones. In South America it is more or less similar, while Africa would see 15 million military casualties and 40 million civilians. Asia would be the biggest loser, with them losing 50 million military casualties, while close to 200 million civilians would perish, leading us to a total death toll before the nuclear war at 393 million casualties. With the nukes landing and killing millions of people, the death toll may rise to 1 billion people. In the year of 1980, the population of the Earth was about 4.4 billion people, so close to 25% of the entire population would perish in the Third World War. This leaves us close with 3 billion people to live in the green areas, which would result in more conflicts and overpopulation. The Europeans would have to abandon most of the continent and move to North Africa, hence why I'm not showing any country's borders. Out of these survivors, due to most of the world not being inhabitable, we can see mass famine and death, so the majority of the casualties I think would ensue after the Third World War, due to the nuclear winter. So who won the war? Well, as you can see, there would be no clear winner, so predicting what happens next would be close to impossible. The survivors would struggle and I can see an identity of anti-war to develop, but there is another problem. Using the borders of Europe as to before the war, most countries there were ultranationalist, so this ideology is likely never eradicated from the face of Earth. I think it may become similar to communism in our own history, where despite the fall of the Soviet Union, many in Eastern Europe still remember it fondly. This means that even if Germany ceases to be ultranationalist, there will still be people who would want to return this ideology, which would extend to the entirety of Western Europe. Eventually, Eastern Europe becomes more democratic-oriented, while the West is more nationalist, which is the opposite of what we have today, and I think this is quite interesting. Let me go over to Peter and Nadia for our own story, as to remind you they are brother and sister, but would end up separated for 3 decades, where the two wouldn't recognize each other. Peter would shoot Nadia's husband, which is Werner, at point blank. This makes Nadia deeply depressed while in Polish jail. Since she doesn't recognize her brother, in her mind she would think that she lost him in 1939 during the Second World War. She lost her child in 1965 due to the Himmlerites forcefully taking him as a soldier during the German Civil War, from which she never heard, assuming he was also dead. She also lost her husband, who was shot right in front of her by her brother, but most importantly, she lost herself. In the previous episode, Peter spoke in Polish in front of her. This is when she broke down in tears and realized that she doesn't remember the Polish language anymore and was properly Germanized, without her even realizing. Now she is sitting in a Polish jail contemplating life. She wouldn't be welcomed back in Germany due to her Polish origins and being non-Aryan, while she is also not welcome in Poland either due to her being Germanized, had a German husband and a German child, as well as not speaking the Polish language. Nadia is practically not welcomed anywhere, and as she is pushing into her early 50s, she would realize that she has lost everything. Her brother, her husband, her child, her country, her heritage, her entire existence. Everything. The name Nadia in most Slavic languages comes from the word Nadezhda, which means hope. The hope that everything would be better. The hope of the bright future. Oh, the hope. Nadia would lose hope. She wouldn't live up to her name. She is broken and lost everything that she once knew and loved. Being in her early 50s, there would be no hope left, nothing to live for. Nadia would decide to take her life because the lack of hope for a better future, as the world is destroyed beyond repair within several generations. There is no hope for billions of people. The story of Werner, Nadia and Peter wouldn't be a single incident in this alternate world, but it would be repeated hundreds of thousands times throughout Eastern Europe. Just the names and the faces would change, but the story would end all in the same way, a lack of hope. Rest in peace, Nadia. The world is truly unrecognizable now. All hope for a better future would be lost.